Allow me to introduce to you all three of my guests as we talk about the tax break offered to you by SARS, the Department of Finance, if you buy solar panels. Franz Tomasek is my guest, Head of Legislative Policy at SARS. Franz, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time, sir.
Good evening to you, your listeners, and thanks for having me.
Much appreciated. And Marle Van Niekerk, Director of Personal Income from National Treasury, thank you for joining us this evening.
Good evening, Aubrey, and thank you very much for having us. And I hope that we can
Indeed.
help tonight.
Indeed. We really appreciate you choosing to come and talk to us, Marle. Much appreciated. And of course, Delano Abdoll, the team leader and cross-border taxation expert at Tax Consulting SA. Good evening to you. And once again, thank you for joining us, Delano, and really just helping us think all of these issues through last week in our conversation. Really appreciate your time, sir.
Good evening to you too, Aubrey, and to the guests and everyone who's listening. Thanks again for the opportunity.
I'm going to ask you, Delano, to listen very attentively as I ask some of the questions that we weren't entirely clear about last week when we had our conversation, and where I am perhaps not asking the question in the right way, in the right context. Please, I want you to jump in and perhaps give clarity as to how we can get the best out of my two guests from the two government departments. Please, will you do that, sir?
Sounds good, Aubrey.
Much appreciated. Franz, let me start with you, because I suppose you are, SARS is the organ of state that we as members of the public are going to be coming to get the tax break for our panels. How, from your perspective, does this regime work? Franz?
Right. So the way this works is it's a scheme that works for panels that are installed and brought into use from the 1st of March of this year to the end of February next year. And what happens is you determine what the cost of the panels is that's being paid over, and you take 25% of the cost of the solar panels, and you get that as a credit against your tax. So it's not a deduction where you would take it as an expense against your income. This is 25% of the cost of the solar photovoltaic panels, and that is claimed as a reduction of the tax you pay.
So first of all, you don't get money; you get a credit against your tax bill.
That's correct.
So if I've bought panels that are worth 50,000 rands, 25% of that, whatever that is, I won't get physical cash from SARS. I'll get a credit.
That's right. So in that case, 12,500 rand is deducted from the tax that you owe us, and then you pay us the balance.
Okay. Delano, we had a conversation about this last week, and part of what we were trying to sort of ascertain was, are we talking about a whole system? In other words, the panels, the inverter, the batteries. Is there anything that we should be asking Franz? He's here. We want to be able to get the greatest value out of him. From your perspective, Delano?
Aubrey, I think a good question, and something that would be very informative to ask, is to understand the rationale behind the incentive being based on the solar panel and not necessarily the system or the components that go together to make the solar system work.
Franz, would you be able to help us with that?
So here we get into the policy questions, where I think Marle is probably best placed to give you the background to that, because if you have to think about it, Treasury and the Minister set the policy, SARS implements it. So that's a policy question that I'm going to pass over to Marle, if I may.
Marle, please help us out there, and perhaps as you answer the question, help us understand the relationship that the Department of Finance or National Treasury has with SARS in this instance, in the creation of policy, and of course, as Francis just said, that they must actually carry that policy out. How does that relationship work? And then more directly, the question that we've just asked around the rationale for 25% for the panels specifically and not for the whole system.
Sure, thank you. I think it helps to backtrack just to where this comes from, and it was an announcement sort of foreshadowed in the SONA earlier in the year that there would be support of some sort to ensure that we can expand our generating capacity because the crisis that we face is one of supply of electricity. And the minister then announced in the budget speech that there would be tax incentives, and the one that we are talking about tonight is the one that is in the personal income tax domain. So that would be individuals who are registered for tax and have a tax liability who would then be able to claim this incentive. In the meantime, we put out a frequently asked questions document, which gave broad strokes for what we intend at that time to do. And in the meantime, on the 21st of April, we published draft legislation. So there's a public consultation process, and we invite public comments until the 15th. And I think, given that I can actually ask for comments, and we really welcome inputs that people have on the design of this incentive.
Well, let's make that invitation even now, Marle. Please give us a call on 011-883-0702. Any insights, any commentary that you might want to give around the rationale for the 25% on panels specifically, but generally on the whole story of trying to incentivize you and I as homeowners to buy panels to, I suppose, circumvent the issue of blackouts. Go ahead, Marle.
Yes. So our public comment process runs through 2 emails. So I think the invitation is open for anyone to send their comments to us. I can leave the email address maybe with the producer, or I can read it out later. But the point is that process actually also entails having meetings, etc., with all the commentators. So that's a very involved process, and Delano would probably tell you. We take people's comments very seriously, and we want to understand how people view the policy. So from here, once it is law, SARS implements the policy, but we obviously work closely together with SARS in designing something that is implementable, and make sure that we dot the I's, cross the T's, and make sure that the legislation is as clear as possible. And I'm sure that in a little while, Franz will tell you about SARS's strategic objectives, which include making tax as clear as possible. So this incentive comes at a time when we have a severe crisis. And the idea behind it, the philosophy behind it, is that we want to ensure that we use public money as well as possible. I wouldn't be a Treasury official if I didn't say that. And in designing this incentive, we're trying to pinpoint the place where we face the biggest constraint, and that is generation. So the way that we've tried to design the whole incentive is to say which part of the system that a household can install for themselves is the one that is most critical for us at this point in time. And we are very cognizant of the fact that installing a system of this nature requires an inverter, in most cases batteries, and then, installation, obviously. But the component that is most directly tied to generation is actually the photovoltaic panels. So we target that quite directly. On the one hand, that is, I think, the part of the system that makes most policy sense for the crisis that we have. We're also very cognizant of the fact that you probably won't be able to use panels if you don't have the inverter, etc. But you would be able to use an inverter and batteries without panels, in which case you may actually be increasing demand on the grid rather than reducing it. So the third, I think, important reason is because we need to ensure that there's a certain cost that would be eligible for the credit, and that there's a cap, of course, so that we don't have an open-ended fiscal commitment. And just in terms of affordability, there's a very big difference in providing a credit for the whole system relative to the component that we think makes most sense. So in terms of the exclusions that we have, that was the main rationale behind it.
Marle, and Delano, please help me here. But if the idea is to try and assist in the generation of electricity by domestic homes, right? And you just are subsidizing, I'm using the word subsidizing in this case carefully, advisedly, just the panels. But you can't really get the panels to function if you don't have all of the other systems. Is it not a defeating of the very idea that inspired all of this, Marle?
I don't think so. And the main reason behind that is because we know that generation is the most important part here. And there are many households that would have parts of the system but never get to the point where they generate additional electricity by installing, say, for instance, an inverter and a battery system as a backup. And while I think we don't have a problem with that, obviously, the question here is how is public money best spent at this point in time? Is it to tie people over for a backup system, or is it to actually look towards the future and have more renewable energy generated, even at household level?
Delano, help me here with the thinking from, I suppose, the consumer's perspective. What do you make of the rationale here?
I think the rationale is definitely a topic for public comment. That's for sure. And I think we certainly have a better idea, Aubrey, than what we had in our previous discussion.
Yep.
But I do identify asking the question, well, is the homeowner or someone of a household not going to contemplate the cost of the system, albeit that the direct impact to add generation capacity is only the solar panel? I'm not sure, Aubrey, if we...
Yeah. Sorry, I was hoping that Marle was going to jump in quickly. Marle?
So I think, Delano, I think you're asking the question about sort of what is the hurdle for the household. Am I understanding it correctly? In making that decision?
Yes, perhaps some sort of barrier.
Yes. So I think whenever we try to design incentives of this nature, I'm an economist by training, so you must please excuse me if this is a detail. But what we try to do is actually we will try to influence behavior through an instrument, and this instrument is a tax incentive. So the behavior that we're interested in here is that hurdle, that switch, where the household decides, the household probably decides, we know that in order to tie us over for a backup system, we already need something like an inverter and a battery. But we want to make sure that household now has an incentive to say, okay, if we're going to already invest in a battery and an inverter, now we can get a tax incentive for taking that extra step to also invest in panels, because that's what the country needs relative to what the household needs.
Yeah. All right, give us a call on 011-883-0702. That aspect of the thinking behind the tax break that you get specifically for panels. And let me ask Franz. Franz, I mean, have you had anybody thus far apply for these tax breaks from a homeowner thus far? And how many folks, I don't know, have been applying for this tax break thus far?
All right, so we're still pretty early in the process because it's only draft legislation, and this is something that would, because it's a deduction from your tax, only come into play either from your provisional tax payments that you make, if you're a provisional taxpayer, or on your assessment at the end of the year, if you are a taxpayer that isn't a provisional taxpayer, so a normal or salaried taxpayer, if I can put that in inverted commas.
Yeah.
So we won't have people applying just yet because, first of all, the legislation isn't in place, and second of all, we haven't gotten to that time of the tax year yet when that will be happening.
We take a call from a listener, Lucky, in Pretoria East. Hi, Lucky, your thoughts?
Hi, Aubrey. Thanks for giving me an opportunity.
Sure.
I'm of the view that the proposal that is being made by your guest is not going to be practical, in a sense that that will not serve as an incentive for somebody who is already on pension to install those kinds of things if the only benefit will accrue only from SARS. Some people are on pension, they no longer have any relationship to a certain extent with SARS. They don't submit tax returns. The best option would be to give that benefit at the point of sale, rather than them having to go and through the process of having to fill forms and submit tax returns to claim that kind of thing. Some people are already out of the system. They're already on pension. Their houses are paid off. So there will be no incentive for somebody in a position like that to go through the trouble of going to SARS and do this and that. At the point of sale where a person buys this equipment, that is where the benefit should accrue.
And practically, how would it work, you think, Lucky?
For instance, well, of course, it's something that still needs to be thought out properly. But at face value, I would think instances of giving discounts or a rebate at the point of sale, depending on the value that somebody would have invested in.
Okay. Franz, any comment on what Lucky has to say in Pretoria, that perhaps this benefit should happen at the point of sale rather than through an elaborate process of applications and so forth, and the idea that maybe some people have perhaps are no longer part of the tax of the tax base, formally speaking, pensioners and so forth. How do you respond to that, Franz?
Right, so I think there are two legs to that question. The one is, what do you do with people who are not in the tax system? And Treasury understands that is an issue, and I believe there are a package of measures that are being looked at to assist there. So this is just one part of a bigger picture. So you've already mentioned this is for individuals. We're talking about businesses next week. But those are both the tax-paying portion of the bigger picture, but there are other parts of the bigger picture that will also come into play to assist people outside of the tax system. So that's the first point. The second is that if you were to try and do something as a reimbursement at the point of sale, you'd have to work out who would administer that. I mean, it probably wouldn't be SARS because this now has nothing to do with tax. So you would have to find someone to administer it. And then you would have to find a mechanism for identifying who the points of sale are and how you would reimburse them. So there are many different ways of getting a result, but you'd have to think through, as the caller mentioned, the actual mechanics of doing it. And that would be a very, very different thing. What international experience has shown in the tax field, though, is if you do things at point of sale, there is a temptation for the supply chain to soak up a good portion of the benefit. Because if it's at point of sale, then the price can increase so that after the subsidy, you're left with pretty much where you were to begin with. Now, that may come across as a slightly cynical viewpoint, but there's a good deal of research to show that actually happens in practice, that the supply chain sees the gap and soaks up a good portion of the benefit. So those are all the kinds of factors that you would have to put into play to decide if you wanted to go down that road.
Yeah.
As it is, we haven't. We've gone with a tax benefit as part of a broader package of interventions.
Delano, I mean, looking at the question that Lucky from Pretoria East has asked now, would it be possible, I suppose, from somebody such as yourself, to organize some sort of process that would allow people who are looking to get this tax break, who are perhaps not in the formal tax system? Would there be practical ways of doing that? Is this a good idea that Lucky is putting on the table?
It could be a good idea, but we're still in a legislative process which does give us some guidance as to what is the group that would be able to apply for the incentive and what administrative steps, or who will administer what, in what way. So it's a bit broad, I think, at this moment, Aubrey, to kind of delve into that question.
At a policy level, Marle, have we made enough provision to try and catch as much of the South African population as possible, tax-paying and non-tax-paying, in this policy?
I think this particular policy runs through the tax system. So that is going to cater for registered taxpayers with a tax liability. The other parts of the system would be on-budget funding for a number of interventions, regulatory interventions, but some of the direct interventions towards ESCOM, and then certainly any of the other financial incentives that the Minister had in the budget. I would not claim to be an expert on all of them, but I can definitely tell you more about the tax part.
Sure. Let me take a call from Tseko in Johannesburg. Hi, Tseko.
Hi, how are you?
Sure, I'm very well, thanks. Tseko, what's your question?
Hi, my question, I think the other caller just asked the same question, but then maybe to take it further is to say, is there, not a way of, instead of us following that route of going to SARS, can't we just be, even if it means you are getting the discount at the till point, or instead of getting the discount at the till point, you are giving maybe extra 2 panels if you are buying 5 panels, something of that nature. That 25%, percentage that they are talking about, instead of following that long route of going to SARS. Because, if it's an incentive, it must be something that is encouraging someone to, wherever he's teaching, to say, hey, I think I must go and install panels. That's my first question. Then the second one is to say, in terms of the panels, currently I don't know if maybe there's a regulator or anything, because after this whole issue of load shedding, there's been a lot of suppliers of solar panels. So we don't even know which one is what you can call maybe regulated. Is this system regulated, or are there any approved products, or what else? What is it that we as the citizens are supposed to look for when we are looking at buying the panels?
I hear you.
Listening on the radio.
I hear you. And Delano, we had the conversation last week around what the regulation says, at least at this stage, when it speaks of new and unused solar panels. Last week when we had that conversation, and I think it ties in very nicely with the second part of Tseko's question as to, are there any minimum requirements as to the quality of the solar panels themselves? Anything that you might want to add to that question, Delano?
Aubrey, I think you are spot on in respect of our question of new and unused. I think something we could add, based on the caller's question, is how would individuals be able to identify if a solar installer is accredited, or what minimum requirements are there for them to be able to issue the solar installation certificate of compliance?
Franz?
Alrighty, so there are a few questions sort of bundled up into one there. Let's begin with the easy one, which is the new and unused. I know we've had some questions around, why new and unused? Why not simply new? And that's really just to provide clarity. So just to give you a day-to-day example, if you buy a demo car from a motor vehicle dealer, is that a new car or is it a used car? The registration papers will say it's new, but it's most certainly used. So new and unused makes it clear what we're talking about. So just as that, as to deal with that one aspect. It's also used quite often in the Income Tax Act, so the tax consulting fraternity would be familiar with it. Now we get to the question of minimum requirements for the panels themselves. The only one we've specified in the legislation is that the panel must be capable of generating at least 275 watts or more. And that's really just to make sure that these are proper sized panels for a solar PV installation. It's actually a fairly low bar. Some of the more sophisticated, but admittedly more expensive panels will do better than that. But SARS isn't really in the business of sort of trying to put thumb on the scale when it comes to, who you select as your supplier, what product you select. That's really a consumer choice thing. And that consumer choice would fit into a broader regulatory framework, which brings us to the third part of the question, which is the certificate of compliance. Now, as I understand it, whenever you change your electrical installation at your home and it goes to the distribution board, you need to have an electrical certificate of compliance, which is issued in terms of the electrical installation regulations of 2009. Now, that is a regulatory requirement as it stands right now. And since we're talking about a solar panel that's connected into your distribution board via the inverter or whatever else is required to make that happen, you've tripped that particular requirement to get a certificate of compliance. So you're firmly into the regulatory framework that already exists, that the Department of Labour has in terms of those regulations. And so the person who would issue you that certificate of compliance is the so-called registered person in terms of the regulations. And that would be a person who has applied to the Department of Labour to be recognized as a registered person, has been approved as such, and has got the authority to issue certificates of compliance. So that then is how that all fits together. And all we're doing is we're piggybacking on that and saying, okay, it is already a regulatory requirement to get a certificate of compliance, so we'd like you to have one. And then that moves on into yet another aspect which we haven't touched on yet, which is the potential for those persons who are issuing the certificates of compliance to in fact provide information to SARS, which would assist us to make the taxpayers who are claiming that lives a little easier. But no, that's probably a point for a little discussion later.
Yeah. While we're on that, Franz, I mean, it brings me to the issue of the fact that the validity of this tax break starts only from the 1st of March 2023. There are people who may have bought solar panels and the accompanying system way before that, right? And they may have used, the guy down the road who knows a lot of stuff about electricity. Maybe not an accredited individual who's going to be able to give a certificate of compliance. And what's the thinking about starting on the 1st of March? Maybe that's a question for Marle. Why the 1st of March, Marle, if this is really a national, or the reason why we're doing all of this is to assist the generation side in the whole power crisis issue. Why are we not including those people who would have bought solar panels before the 1st of March and have them be a part of this incentive? Does that make sense? Does that question make sense, Marle?
It makes sense. I think the first part of the question is why the specific date. The 1st of March 2023 was the first start of a personal income tax year after the announcement by the Minister of Finance. So from the sort of the tax legal perspective, that is the first practical date that we had available. And indeed, as the legislative process is only unfolding now, effectively it means that any eligible purchases that are underway would then qualify.
But doesn't it lock out anybody who has participated in this process of providing relief to the grid before the 1st of March? I mean, if I bought panels on the 28th of February, because we don't have a 29th unless it's leap year, does that mean I'm not going to be able to participate?
I think it's behavior, sort of like the behavioral economic perspective on that would be if you didn't require the tax incentive and you would have made the investment anyway, then that would actually have been a redundancy from the fiscal perspective, because we would be paying for something that would have happened anyway. So that would be, I think, the technical answer. The practical answer is, I think the way that we've designed this incentive, we are not necessarily excluding anyone who already has a system but would choose to expand the system. So we are interested in new generation capacity from the 1st of March 2023.
But we've had this problem for 15 years, Marle. Surely somebody that has been participating by buying panels before the 1st of March should be allowed to participate.
If they were to expand their system and therefore expand our generation capacity, they would be able to.
Are you getting these kinds of questions, Franz, from your perspective?
Sure. The difficulty is how far back do you go? Because you said the person
15 years ago?
28. Well, so how would you run that through the tax year? Because that tax year is long since gone. What we would call prescription in the tax world has applied. That tax year is locked down. Absent fraud or some pretty serious misrepresentation and behavior of that kind, we can't go back and reopen that year. It's closed to us and to the taxpayer. So I think that's part of the issue here is what is practically possible. And as Marle has said, if you've had somebody who, for whatever reason, has decided that they can do this and they didn't need any assistance from the state to do it, sort of going back to try and do it now sort of makes it a lot more expensive, and it also creates a number of issues around proof. How would you prove what you did? The practical difficulties mount up very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah. All right. Delano, one of the things that you and I were discussing last week was the whole issue of the submission of third-party information to SARS and how that would be audited on the number of solar panels installations for which an electrical certificate of compliance would be issued. Just go back to that question for me and clarify it for me, and then let's field it out to any of our guests that can answer the question.
So, Aubrey, I actually had a comment on the previous question. I don't know if you
Sure, go ahead. Please, go ahead. Please, Delano.
I was just trying to think of the question from a different perspective to say, well, if we can't go backwards, why are we limiting the period only to a year?
Franz? Hello, Franz?
This is actually a question for Marle, but I think part of the desire here is to have action as quickly as possible. South Africans are notorious for leaving things to the last moment, and I suspect if you had a longer period, some people would feel that they could leave it for later. But I'll let Marle come in if she wants to add to that.
Marle, please help us out with that.
Yes, I think it's the urgency of the problem, and we want to, as I said earlier, we want to influence decision making, and the financial incentive is there to say, can we do this faster than we usually would have? I think the rationale for sunset date itself is that we actually don't like open-ended tax incentive programs. So as far as possible, we have sunset dates for all of our tax incentive programs. Indeed, the tax practitioner world will tell you we've had some of them lapse because they did not necessarily achieve their objectives. So there's also sort of a public accountability aspect to it too, that this is an urgent program and it runs a specific time, and in this case it is 1 year.
Yeah. Delano, any final comments on that score? But I do want to hear your thoughts about that conversation we had last week around third-party information to SARS and so forth.
I'm happy with the comments. Thanks for accommodating that question.
Sure.
Regarding our conversation, the question pertained to the draft public notice. And in particular, we were discussing the form which mentioned certain prescribed information that would have to be submitted. So that was the context.
Yes.
We had that discussion, and we kind of debated a few points which I think we've addressed in part because we discussed the legislation aspect as well now.
So you're comfortable with the responses thus far. All right, let me go straight to the lines again. I can tell you now, Marle and Franz, that there's a lot of unhappiness about the 1st of March cutoff date. I can tell you right now. But let's take some calls. Sybil is in Johannesburg. Hi, Sybil.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very good, thanks. Go ahead, Sybil.
So I just want to circle back to that 1st of March. While I understand the concept behind, obviously, from the 1st of March, it's obviously new relief pressure off the grid. The people that have pre-existing solar systems installed in their homes relieved pressure from the grid. So why would they not be able to claim the rebate for doing their part ahead of, jumping on the bandwagon? They've already installed, they've alleviated pressure from the grid. Should they not, to at least some extent, receive some sort of something in terms of
some incentive, thank you for being a good team player?
We're trying to help the grid here, we're trying to help the country, but we didn't wait until there was something. But now that you're offering something, why can we not be a part of that?
Marle, I'm going to let you answer that question again. It looks like it's going to be coming through a lot. You'll probably be getting a lot of submissions around that question. Marle?
No problem. I think the conceptual point is this was the closest date to the announcement itself. And from a sort of like an administrative justice perspective, retroactive and retrospective announcements are actually very problematic. So we really try not to do that for particularly an incentive program where you cannot actually go back to the past and decisions that had already been taken. I think the most important point is any tax incentive is actually there for to make decision making. And to tip the scale in favor of a public outcome. And while I hear what Sybil is saying, the tax system itself can't go back in time. So from a practicality perspective, as Franz indicated, we can't do that through the tax system.
Franz, anything that you might want to add?
I think Marle has covered it, but I think going into the future, I know there are thoughts around being able to sell excess power back into the grid, either on a net billing or a outright sale basis. So people who have made installations and want to expand them, that's certainly something that would give them a benefit from a cash perspective in a different context. I know this is happening in the Western Cape, and I know nationally that's something that's being thought on quite hard.
Let's talk to Gerard in Pretoria East. Hi, Gerard.
Hello, Aubrey. Just a lot of comments. I mean, at this stage, SARS let's call it the government's willing to give us a rebate back on the panels only, but panels cannot function without the inverter. Earlier this year, I just heard the comments as well that there would have been option to basically give electricity back to Eskom. But as soon as you go to an inverter that's able to actually supply the electricity back into the grid, you'll actually be smart inverter, and the inverter might actually turn out to be more expensive than the panels on your roof. And the incentive, the more I listen to the outcomes and read the articles that's available, they are really trying to encourage the guys to regulate a backup system with an inverter and a battery backup to put on panels. But there's no guarantee that the panels or the inverter, let's call it the inverter they've got, is actually capable of putting electricity back into the system. So in retrospect, it doesn't really, they're not gaining anything except for free electricity and only 50% less. Well, Eskom's increases is in excess of 15% per annum going forward, and nobody knows where it's going to end. I mean, where's the real reward for the end user?
Franz?
So I take the point about people who are feeding back into the grid needing more sophisticated equipment, but bear in mind the reward for that more sophisticated equipment is in fact a payment or an offset from the electricity supplier. So that's the linkage there. I think the point that's just been made, that this would serve as a powerful incentive for people who are currently with a battery and inverter setup to add panels, is a very valid one. As I think Marle mentioned a little earlier, if you're currently sitting with a battery and inverter setup, that's very convenient for the household, makes a good deal of sense there. But from a national perspective, that means that you're charging batteries, which is inefficient in and of itself. So you're in fact increasing the load of the grid on the grid overall. So if we can encourage people in that situation to in fact add those solar panels and then become, rather than extra consumers on the grid, lesser consumers on the grid, I think that would be a very valuable policy success from Treasury's perspective. But I'll let Marle speak to that one if she wants to agree or disagree.
Marle?
Indeed. I think how Gerard sort of approached the problem is that you cannot use the panels without the inverter and battery potentially.
For the household specifically, right?
For the household specifically.
Yeah.
I think we also look at it from the other side to say you can use the inverter and the battery without the panels. And that is good for the household, but we have to look at the public interest, and the public interest there is in the generation aspect of that system. And I think kind of, as Francis said earlier, it would be a big gain for us if we can help people into generation and not just storage, or shifting their demand to a time when there isn't load shedding.
Will the actual cost to be calculated be inclusive or exclusive of value-added tax, Franz?
It will be inclusive. We're in the personal income tax space here. We're not dealing with businesses.
Yep.
In the business context, that becomes a little bit more difficult because it depends on whether you're registered for VAT, whether all your suppliers are taxable in the VAT system. But fortunately, we don't have to discuss that this evening. We're in the domestic personal space.
Sure.
So that's inclusive.
Okay. So obviously, as we have more conversations about this, we'll be able to touch on the business side of things. Delano, I've leaned on you for questions and just contextualization for my listeners and myself. Any questions? Any conclusions that you want to bring to this conversation?
Conclusions, difficult. I think we definitely know a bit more, and I think the public at large is a bit smarter. And I'm very grateful for us being able to discuss and unpack these things just to make us know a bit more. don't know about what your thoughts are, Aubrey.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Delano. I mean, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to, lean and glean from my colleagues at SARS and National Treasury about a whole myriad of other issues that listeners have been asking us about. For example, the whole issue of how much money can I take out of the country, and what are the thresholds there? I'm hoping, Franz, that I'll be able to come back to you and ask you to help us out to help our listeners understand a little bit more about that, and maybe Marle too, just from a policy point of view, you could help us out with that stuff.
So, I mean, if we're starting to talk about taking money out of the country, I'm probably going to ask that you help bring some of our colleagues from the Financial Surveillance Unit at the Reserve Bank into the picture, because they have a good deal to say about that.
Okay.
But yes, there is a linkage into the tax system because of the need to demonstrate tax compliance once you start taking more than R1 million out of the country a year. And so there is a linkage with SARS.
So I'll definitely come back to you to direct me to some of the colleagues out at SARS. Marle, I want to thank you also for agreeing to talk to us and just helping us with some of the policy rationale in some of the issues that we were talking. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Aubrey, and we are here to serve the public, so this is part of our job.
Marle Van Niekerk, Director, Personal Income from National Treasury. Thank you so much. Franz Tomasek, Head of Legislative Policy at SARS. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Delano, thank you also for agreeing to talk to our guests and help us through that whole conversation. We really appreciate it. How do people get in touch with you, by the way, Delano?
Thank you very much, Aubrey. People can get in touch with me. They can just find our website, Tax Consulting South Africa. Contact us on email. We also have a Facebook group as well as a LinkedIn group, similar to our previous conversation, and happy to assist.
Thank you so much, Delano Abdoll. I'm being asked to ask all of my other guests from SARS and National Treasury as to how they can be reached. Marle, are you happy to give us details to reach you?
I think, Aubrey, so a lot of the information is on our website, and I'd encourage anyone to have a look at it. And then the comment process, the public comment process that's open at the moment, is via email. So the two email addresses for SARS and Treasury for that purpose. The SARS email address is acollins, ACOLLINS, @sars.gov.za. And the Treasury address is 2022 Annex C Prop, which is our consultative process for tax proposals. So 2022 Annex C Prop @treasury.gov.za.
Much appreciated, Marle. Thank you. Franz, do you have a contact detail for us, perhaps?
So I'm going to do what Marle did and point people at our website. You will find the documents that we're talking to now under our legal counsel page. It's under documents for public comment. And you'll find the legislation, explanatory memorandum, and other bits of information that you'd find useful in this context right there.
Franz, thank
you so much. As well as the email addresses that Marle just mentioned.
Franz, thank you once again for joining us this